Prepare to be surprised. In Luke's Gospel, in the 24th chapter, Luke depicts two men who were walking on the road from Jerusalem to Emmaus. They were walking along, talking, in deep conversation, grieving the death of Jesus. They had thought of him as their Messiah, or at least had dared to hope he would be. And then he was gone. They were mourning the loss. Suddenly alongside of them came another man who was Jesus, but they didn't recognize him, and he did nothing to let on who he was. He asked them what was going on, and they were surprised to think that anybody would not know what had happened in recent days in Jerusalem. So they explained how Jesus had been crucified by the authorities, how deeply disappointed they were in all of this, how some of their women in their group had gone to the tomb and found it was empty, and had discovered angels there telling them that Jesus had risen from the dead. And then some men from the group went and verified their story. These men were terribly puzzled as they walked along the road, and Jesus chastised them a little bit and actually told them that the scriptures pointed out that the Messiah would go through these things. Well, the day was progressing, and as they got to Emmaus, it was getting late, and they invited Jesus to stay with them. He consented to go to their place, and at supper time, just as they were breaking bread together, their eyes were opened, and they realized who he was. And then he disappeared suddenly. Within the hour, they were packed up and headed back to Jerusalem to find the other disciples and to tell them what they had experienced. And that's where we pick up the story in Luke chapter 24, verse 35. And it says this: "Then the two from Emmaus told their story of how Jesus had appeared to them as they were walking along the road, and how they had recognized him as he was breaking the bread. And just as they were telling about it, Jesus himself was suddenly standing there among them. 'Peace be with you,' he said. But the whole group was startled and frightened, thinking they were seeing a ghost. 'Why are you frightened?' he asked. 'Why are your hearts filled with doubt? Look at my hands. Look at my feet. You can see that it's really me. Touch me and make sure that I am not a ghost, because ghosts don't have bodies as you see that I do.' As he spoke, he showed them his hands and his feet. Still, they stood there in disbelief, filled with joy and wonder. Then he asked them, 'Do you have anything here to eat?' They gave him a piece of broiled fish, and he ate it as they watched. The whole group was startled and frightened, thinking they were seeing a ghost. Now, one criticism of the resurrection that has been leveled against the idea of Christ rising from the dead is that the disciples were looking forward to this so intensely that they probably just convinced themselves that it happened. In fact, some have suggested that maybe they just hallucinated and imagined that Jesus actually was alive again. But no, they didn't expect him to rise from the dead. They had seen him die, seen him crucified. They had seen his body twisted and beaten and hanging from a crude wooden cross. They had no expectation to see him alive, having been what he'd been through. And so to suggest that they merely were making this up because they expected it is to completely misinterpret history. No, they weren't expecting him. He had to convince them that he was tangible, physical, that he was not a ghost. And their perception of reality was that this sort of thing just does not happen. People don't rise from the dead. Jesus, on the other hand, simply said to them, "Why are you frightened?" Not to be irreverent, but whenever I've read this account of Jesus appearing to the disciples, I've found it almost funny that he would say, "Why are you frightened?" I think that if I were in that room, I would have perhaps thought, but not said, "Well, Lord, we saw you very dead, and now you appear to be very alive, and you didn't use the door. So that's why I'm frightened." Jesus, though, understood that resurrection was the norm for what was to happen to him. He knew this would take place. And he was very familiar with the Old Testament prophets' references to resurrection. In fact, he would have been familiar with the prophecy that God gave through Ezekiel when he referred to the valley of dry bones. And he speaks to these and says, "Look, I am going to put breath into you and make you live again." It's in Ezekiel 37, verse 5. So Jesus pressed on to convince the disciples that he was in fact real and he was risen from the dead. And he invited them to touch him. He said, "Why are your hearts filled with doubt?" He showed them his hands and his feet, still bearing the gouge marks from the enormous spikes that had been driven through them. John, one of the disciples, later would record in 1 John, "We saw him with our own eyes and touched him with our own hands. He is the word of life." But if we think Jesus had an easy time convincing the disciples, we've misinterpreted again. Verse 41 says otherwise. It says, "Still they stood there in disbelief, filled with joy and wonder." They still didn't know whether to believe it or not. Disbelief, joy, and wonder. It seemed just too good to be true. So Jesus pressed the point. It says, "Then he asked them, 'Do you have anything here to eat?'" I don't think it's true, but sometimes I imagine just a note of exasperation in his voice. All right, I'll eat something for you." And so they produced a piece of broiled fish. What a human touch by the Son of God to say to his disciples, "Friends, let's have fish together." If that's not proof that I'm alive again, what is? Because everybody needs to eat. And so he ate it while they watched him. Christ is the same today. We may experience fear. We may wonder what's going on. We may wonder what's coming next. But he's equally present. And he says, "Peace be with you." Why are you afraid? Why are you filled with doubts? I'm here, and I have everything under control, and I know what's going to happen next. Are you prepared to be surprised? He is risen. Every other religious leader in the history of the world is still in the grave, but not Christ. He rose again. In fact, history records in the New Testament that over 500 people witnessed him walking around, spoke to him, were seen with him. The Apostle Paul wrote about that and said that some of them are still here. You can go ask them when he wrote this. The record shows that he rose from the dead. Lee Strobel, who was an avowed atheist and who set about trying to disprove the resurrection of Christ and was convinced otherwise by the evidence, points out that at the time of his writing this, the leading trial lawyer in the world, who had had 245 consecutive victories, also was on a spiritual journey and had taken his legal expertise to examine the veracity and the credibility of Christ's resurrection. He concluded that beyond a shadow of a doubt, the evidence said Christ rose again. In fact, he wrote this, "I say unequivocally that the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ is so overwhelming that it compels acceptance by proof which leaves absolutely no room for doubt." Peace be with you. He is risen. He is risen indeed.